This part of the lecture, we are going to discuss assumptions and beliefs in regards to health behavior change. And so some of these assumptions, I'm sure we can all identify with. Maybe some of these we've thought ourselves. And so I want you to be open to being challenged and being open to the idea that maybe you have done something a little bit differently, and maybe that you can improve on some of the ways that we communicate with our clients, and maybe even some of the people around us outside of just our clients. So here are some assumptions that we should probably avoid. So there's this assumption that someone ought to change. And where this comes into play, probably most prevalently, is in anti-fat culture that's currently existing in the US and most Western countries. And so what I mean by this is that you might have a client who comes to you and they fill out their health form and you realize that their BMI is 42 kilograms per meter squared. And so right away you're thinking from a medical perspective that they should lose weight. They then come to you and they fill out their goals, and their goals have to do with wanting to complete a triathlon and doing a 5K in 3 weeks. And then once they're done doing those three things or two things, then they're going to move on and they're going to join a kind of CrossFit gym and start getting more into kind of functional fitness. Making this all up, right? If your client came to you and they said all of those things, and you know they had a BMI that put them into an obese category, most of you would assume that they ought to change, meaning they ought to change to lose weight. They ought to lose weight. If this has nothing to do with their goals, if weight loss has nothing to do with their goals, the idea with MI, or the kind of the foundations of motivational interviewing, essentially says that we need to avoid that assumption. We need to avoid that even though we think they need to lose weight, they ought to do that, right? So again, that's really important to know that that's an assumption to avoid with MI. We also want to think that health is a person's prime motivating factor, and in many cases it is not. Sometimes it can be aesthetic based. Sometimes it can be more for money because their job is giving them a discount if they engage in some sort of health behavior coaching. Okay, so there's many reasons outside of health that is a person's primary motivating factor. People are either motivated or not. Well, if you know anything about health behavior, what you do realize is that while some people are more motivated than others, it's a whole range of spectrum, right? So motivation is on a range, and on any given day, someone could be on the more positive end of motivation and or on the more negative end of motivation. Okay. Another assumption to avoid is now is the right time to consider change. So we use that a lot in marketing techniques, right? We say now is the time. Today is the day. And the reason why we do that is because we want to evoke change. We want people to sign up for our package. We want people to pay us money because now is the time. But what MI technique does is it switches that and basically says that we can't assume that this is the right time for them to change. Again, this puts it back on the client as the expert, not us as the expert. And then also, I am the expert and the person must follow my advice. And this takes a little bit of ego checking because for many of you, and I completely understand this, you go to school for so long and you spend so many hours just learning this content. And from a book's perspective, you know how to help this person. But what the book doesn't often talk to you about is that the expert in someone's own life is themselves, not us. And while we certainly have a lot of knowledge in regards to reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease, improving their strength gains, any of those things, we have all that knowledge. We only start to give that knowledge if our client asks us for it. And I'll get into that a little bit later, right? But the MI technique basically says we should not assume that we are the experts. We should assume that they are the experts. So let's go ahead and go through some true and false here. I'm just curious, this is kind of a fun game to play and we're going to learn a lot here. So true or false, until a person is motivated to change, there is not much we can do. Think on that for a little bit. True or false, it usually takes a significant crisis hitting bottom to motivate a person to change? Think about your answer. True or false? Motivation is influenced by human connections. And then lastly, resistance to change arises from deep-seated defense mechanisms. So let's go ahead and go back to number 1. Until a person is motivated to change, there is not much we can do. The answer to that is false, right? Motivation is accessible and can be modified or enhanced at many points in the change process for a client. And our clients may not have to hit bottom or experience terrible and parable consequences to get to that place of wanting to make change, okay? Number 2 is usually takes a significant crisis, right? Kind of alluded to that in my last one. The answer to that is false, okay? While certainly sometimes you hear of these instances where a client does hit rock bottom, and that is the experience that really motivates them, and because of that, they're gonna go ahead and move forward with this health behavior change. That is not what's necessarily needed for good, positive health behavior changes to occur, okay? Number 3, motivation is influenced by human connections. This one is true, okay? So motivation belongs to that person, right? It's different per person. Yet it can be understood to result from the interactions between the individual and other people. So essentially, while motivation is individual to that person, oftentimes it's influenced by how we are connected to other people and things around us in our environment. Okay, so that one is true. And then number 4, resistance to change arises from deep-seated defense mechanisms. So this one is false. Things like denial and rationalization and resistance and arguing, these are all very common defense mechanisms that many people will use to kind of protect themselves emotionally. And if you pause and think, we probably all have used some of those ourselves, right? So when clients are labeled ahead of time as being manipulative or being resistant, right? We probably all have heard of clients like that, maybe and even worked with them. They are given no choice in selecting treatment goals or directed authoritatively to not do something. And so essentially what ends up happening is the result is predictable, okay? So in this case, we need to realize that resistance to change arises from deep-seated defense mechanisms. That is not always the case. So that is a false assumption, okay? Let's go to number 5. People choose whether or not they will change. So ultimately, this is true, right? We understand that they are the experts in their own life and they're going to be the ones who are choosing. But it's certainly important for us to also recognize that there are many external factors that exist that influence how a person behaves. So although change is the responsibility of the client, and many people change their excessive substance or whatever behavior change they're trying to do without therapeutic intervention, it really is kind of beneficial for us to help with that change process. Okay, so number 6, readiness for change involves a balancing of pros and cons. And the answer to this one is true. Okay, so ambivalence needs to be resolved before the change can progress. Number 7, creating motivation for change usually requires confrontation. So I hope your guess to this one is false, right? Anytime it starts with confrontation, I don't think that's a good thing. Confrontation may promote resistance rather than motivation to change. And so that's important. Confrontation will never really start off with a good thing. Instead of creating this kind of idea and culture of motivation, if you're combative with your client right from the beginning, that's usually going to have some sort of resistance and usually is not going to end in a long-term health behavior change. Okay. And then number 8, denial is not a client problem. It is a therapist skill problem. This is an interesting one. So technically this is true, right? So MI views denial and resistance as behaviors evoked by environmental conditions, not as traits or characteristics of these individuals. So a direct comparison of a counselor's style suggests that a confrontational and directive approach may precipitate more immediate client resistance. And then essentially, ultimately, that's going to lead to poorer outcomes that are less client-centered and less supportive. So, to be clear, this one is true. Denial is not a client problem, it is a therapist skill problem. So if you're thinking, I am not a therapist, you're absolutely right. But it is important to kind of understand where this technique came from and to also understand that many of our clients are going to experience denial. And sometimes it's about how we handle that and whether or not that will shift if a person kind of expresses that denial, okay? So let's go ahead and go into some learning recap. So essentially, these are four of the true/false statements that I just went over, 4 of the 8. So I want you to read each one, and I want you to stop and pause and think whether or not you think they are true or false and why. Okay, again, all of these answers we just went over, so make sure that they are correct. If you have questions about these, we can certainly talk about them in lab. We'll spend plenty of time in lab on motivational interviewing. And our next lecture is going to be on MI principles.